Okay, you're live.
Thank you, Ann. Our first presenter this morning, Mr. Gustav Good. I'll let Gustav do his own intros, so I'm new here to this committee. I do not know all of the people yet. So expediency and time and accuracy, I've asked you to do your own intro.
All right, thank you. Right, good morning. My name is Gus Goodwin. I'm an ecologist and conservation planner with the Nature Conservancy in Vermont, and I'm very happy to be here today to speak with you. Start by just giving a very short introduction to the Nature Conservancy. We are a global organization, but we work in 72 different countries, but we've been working here in Vermont for more than 60 years. We're science-based, we're nonpartisan, and we are working to address the twin crisis facing biodiversity and climate change. And our mission is to conserve the lands and waters upon which all life depends. We're probably best known for our land protection work. Maybe some of you have been to our natural areas.
Gaelic preserve.
Yeah, that was the first slide. We have helped protect nearly 300,000 acres in Vermont. That's including nearly a quarter of all state lands. So places like Green River Reservoir, portions of Hamels Hump, Jamaica State Park. And then we currently own and manage about 30,000 acres in 50 natural areas. But our work is very, very broad. We do stream and floodplain restoration, dam removal. We are involved in partnership work and all sorts of different work to restore and protect terrestrial and aquatic systems. And we have an active policy program, which some of you may have already engaged with, like Lauren. And we've also had a long emphasis on landscape scale conservation planning to protect biodiversity. And that's one of my primary areas of responsibility and why I'm in the position I'm speaking to you from today. And I was asked here to talk about biodiversity, ecological integrity kind of in general, and then also to highlight some national and regional trends that are relevant to the work that this committee does in Vermont. And I wanted, just kind of a little bit of an essential starting foundation for your upcoming legislative session. So starting with a very broad definition of biodiversity. This comes from the Biodiversity Project of Vermont, or the Vermont Biodiversity Project. And quite simply, it's the variety of life in all its forms and its interactions between the living and non-living environment. And it translates across scales all the way down from genes up to landforms. And one of the key things about this definition is that it's very broad, and it's also very neutral. It doesn't talk about what's good, what's bad, what are the consequences of changing some elements of biodiversity. And that's one of the reasons I want to introduce this second term, ecological integrity. So if biodiversity helps you just describe what's out there, ecological integrity as a concept helps you think about evaluating and measuring the various aspects of biodiversity. And this is how I'm going to organize my presentation, is thinking through some of these topics and exploring some of the national and regional trends. Right, so the first thing I want to highlight about this definition is that it provides three vantage points to look at biodiversity. We can talk about its composition, its structure, and its function. And I'm going to use those three buckets to kind of organize the rest of my presentation. The second thing, which is probably obvious, but it's absent from this definition, is that it implies that there are forces out there that challenge an ecosystem to support and maintain itself. And these forces run the gamut from small-scale, naturally occurring disturbances like trees falling in a storm to stand-replacing events like hurricanes or tornadoes. From the establishment of a few invasive honeysuckle plants to the arrival of a forest pest that removes an entire species from the forest. And so there's really this kind of spectrum of stressors and disturbances in the natural world. And ecosystems that have high integrity are likely to be much more resilient to those stresses and rebound with similar composition and structures and functions than ecosystems with low integrity. The third point I'd like to make, although I picked a photo where you can't see humans or any sort of human development, we are inherently part of biodiversity and part of the natural world. Our actions have influenced every square inch of our planet, and we have tremendous investment in the long-term survival of our natural systems that ultimately sustain our human communities. Provides us with clean air and water, fiber, fuel, jobs, and so many other benefits that we could spend like the entire hour here talking about them. And I want to also just recognize that this is a really Western framework to look and describe our relationship to the land, how it sustains us and how we sustain it. And there are other like indigenous and traditional ecological knowledge perspectives that would take a very different approach to this presentation. I happen to be a Western trained scientist, so this is the lens I'm going to use, but I just want to recognize that there are lots of other ways to describe the world. I made a note to myself and I forgot to mention it. I only have like 30 minutes of content today. And I wanted to leave plenty of space for questions as part of the instruction for coming. So please stop and interrupt me with questions at any time, or I'm happy to take them at the end, whatever's most convenient for the committee.
Just are those submitted, your testimonies and submitted to our committee?
No, it's not. These are just my speaking notes. But
Okay.
Would you like them?
I'd love them,
Okay.
if possible. I mean, I could just make a copy.
Okay, I can submit them afterwards.
It would be great. Thank you.
Okay, in the interest of moving past this slide, I want to draw your attention back to the last three words, the compositions, structure and function. And these are some of the lenses I think about when thinking about protecting biodiversity or biodiversity plan. So we're going to kind of step through those. The first and probably most familiar dimension of biodiversity is composition, like what species happen to be at a site. And these pretty plants happen to be from the characteristic plants you'd find in a black spruce woodland bog. And nature in general tends towards complexity. So places with high ecological integrity will support more species. And this comes with the caveat that not all ecosystems can support the same number or types of species, right? So this bog is cold, nutrient poor, acidic, and so it definitely supports fewer species than a tropical rainforest. But a bog that has high ecosystem integrity or ecological integrity will support more species than the same type of bog that's in a lower condition. So when you have an intact system, it will support more species that are adapted to that environment. And that's an interesting kind of segue to this idea that it's not just the number of species, but also the amount of those species. So that ecosystem with high integrity will support robust populations of the species that are adapted to live there. So if we want to think about composition, we need to also be thinking about abundance. And the news on this front is sobering. There was a handful of studies that came out in 2017, 2018 that are they're very eye-opening. Across the globe, biomass of mammals is down 82%. 30% of amphibians are now considered threatened or endangered. Butterfly abundance is dropping. There are 3 billion less birds than there were in 1970. And this is true across nearly all groups of birds based on their habitat preferences. And the news from freshwater is even worse. The biodiversity for freshwater systems is estimated to be declining at 2 times the rate of terrestrial systems. So that's hard news. I do want to point to one kind of glimmer of hope that I think is really appropriate for this group. So on the right, you see this graph of, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, this one here with the different habitat types in the bars. So everything that's going to the left are groups and types of birds whose populations have declined. There's one group of birds whose populations have actually grown since 1970. And that's the wetland birds. And the reason is because our country and our states have made a sustained effort at every level, from policy on down to project implementation, to protect wetland habitats, to create policies that protect birds, to address some of the atmospheric crises that also are really important to birds, like pesticides, deposition of mercury, nitrogen, things like that. So with sustained effort, we can actually turn the tide. This graph on the left that shows that plummeting line is reversible with sustained effort, and that policy is an essential piece of that equation. Yeah.
I just wanted to, on the right there, can you explain what those lines mean?
Yes. So This will not help anyone who's watching on Zoom, but this is the change in the population since 1970. So we've lost more than 40% of our grassland birds across North America. Nearly 30% of our boreal forest birds.
What are the darker lines?
These?
Yeah.
Those are the error bars. So how confident we are in that estimate. So this is kind of the high end, the low end, and then this is the average.
And my other question is, do you have data on insects besides butterflies?
No, not off the top of my head, but I'm sure someone's been cataloging that.
Just looking at the number of insects in my windshield suggests.
Yes. No, there's actually papers and they call it like a windshield survey. And they've been, I read something from the European Union where that's like actually the method is they drive around and then they count the bugs in the windshield.
It's hard to identify this species.
Yeah, but just, I mean, that presence, right? Like,
Sorry.
that's something
Okay, I'm
that
just
I remember from
curious.
childhood, the abundance of just so many bugs splattered on the windshield and now I barely clean my windshield.
Okay.
A little closer to home, the Fish and Wildlife Department estimates there's about 23,000 or 43,000 species that call Vermont home. That number is much more precise for the taxa we know best, like vertebrates and plants. And it's just a guess for some of the invertebrates and insects like you were mentioning. And what I want to call attention to is that especially for those species we know best, a significant number of those are considered species of greatest conservation need, which is a designation the Fish and Wildlife Department assigns to species as part of the State Wildlife Action Plan. And so that includes rare species that are threatened and endangered, but it also includes very common species that we believe, or the department believes, need very proactive engagement to make sure they stay common and abundant on our landscape. And again, just kind of highlighting that story of what's happening to wetland birds. That was a loud bang in the next room. The loon is a species that at one point was feared would disappear from Vermont, and the combination of federal action and state actions have kind of stabilized and allowed some of those populations to rebound. And then the bottom photo is a ram's head lady slipper, which is a rare plant in Vermont. We have successfully protected lots of its habitat, but population still is declining. And is considered lost from several sites from a variety of factors, some of which we can determine and some of which are fairly poorly understood, maybe below ground changes to soil chemistry and biology and climate change are kind of two of the leading considerations there. So I want to talk about some of the things that stress biodiversity, particularly from this composition lens in Vermont. So that first photo, which is this kind of green wall, is Japanese knotweed. It's an invasive plant that's very common in our floodplains, and it locally displaces species. So we lose, it takes up all the light. It creates a really dense shaded environment. A lot of the species that you would expect to find in a floodplain cannot thrive underneath that canopy, so they're lost from that site. The next graph, our photo, is the map of the United States. And pick this one to talk about invasive species that can eliminate species, not just remove them from sites, but just eliminate them. So this is a map of forest pests and pathogens by county in the United States. And you can see that the Northeast is ground zero for the abundance of invasive forest pests and pathogens. We have over 400 pests and pathogens that stress our forests here that have been introduced. And this is staggering to me. The cost of this across the country, of these invasive forest pests, is estimated at $4.5 billion per year. We lose 50 million tons of carbon dioxide to these species each year, which is the equivalent of the emissions of 6 million cars. And then I don't really know another way to describe it, but the moral injury of losing a species and watching something that was so abundant in our landscape wink out in our lifetime it's very acute. One of my other projects that I work on is trying to restore American elm to the landscape. And so I have a real firsthand view of how hard it is to fight against this tide.
Can I just ask?
Yeah.
Do I ask?
Please.
Sorry. How do you understand this? Like looking at the Northeast and the rest of the country?
Why do we have so many?
Yeah.
Well, humans have been European colonists have been here and disturbing the forest for longer.
Uh,
We have many ports of entry, so many of these species come from other countries and they're brought over in shipping crates and untreated wood materials. And then we also have really diverse forests. So we have lots of different tree species, and that means that lots of these things, that these kind of random introductions of insects, are more likely to find a suitable host.
Good.
Oh, sorry, was there another question? Yeah.
As well, in the couple of charts ago, you showed a graph that showed a significant decrease in biomass of various species. What does the top end of that chart look like? What types of species are significantly increasing, or are there any? In other words, you showed us the bad news, but is there some good news? And if there is some good news of biomass increasing, are they the pest type of things that are actually increasing? So what's the top end of the chart?
I'm not sure how to answer that. Certainly, some invasive species are doing very well here in Vermont, but I think that they provide different ecological benefits. And so even if one species is becoming more abundant at the detriment of others, I don't know that like biomass is really the right lens to ascribe a value outcome. But it's an interesting question.
But it would be interesting to see what the top end of the graph, what gains are we making? What biomass increases are we seeing, or in what species?
Yeah, I'll give that some
That's a
thought.
great
I don't have an answer.
Lens to look at it through, but that was the type of chart you were presenting for the decrease.
Yeah, that decrease is for things that we think of as very common, like mammals in general. It's a pretty high level bucket.
Like I don't know, many of us kind of seem to, or I hear frequently that, like the bear population that seems to be going up just because there's more interaction with it. But is that true? Is the population of bear actually increasing, or is it
I think it depends on the scale you look at it, right? There are certain places, and Vermont is one where we have this local bear increase. But I think across the globe, I can't speak to black bear populations writ large, but it's kind of what depends on what scale you look at. So last thought, I guess this is an interesting one, given your thought. So we have an overabundant deer population. So we have native species who are unchecked and out of balance. And so that's this photo of deer. And because deer have browse preferences, they prefer some species of trees over other. They're beginning to shift the composition of our forests based on their flavor preferences. And then the last stress, of course, is just habitat loss. So if development or land use degrades habitat, so they no longer can support species. And then, of course, we have all of this overlaid by climate change. And we know that we are watching species move and adapt to climate change in real time. Really high level reviews show that species are moving on average northward, about a mile per year, so 11 miles per decade, and upslope at 36 feet per decade. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but it is actually quite staggering when you start to think about it. So this, the paper that this graph comes from looked at where is the center of the population, and that's how they assigned movement. So if you think about like the amount of movement that needs to happen to move the center of population of Massachusetts from Boston a mile each year, it's not just one species popping up a mile north each time. It's just this kind of like big swell moving north. And there's also data that suggests that they're not keeping up with climate change. So the amount of movement they're doing is for birds. I read a paper that said it's about a third of the movement they need to be doing. And the way they're compensating for that is moving the timing, their life cycle timing to adjust climate. So they're having their young earlier. They're starting to move at different times of the year to adjust to climate change. So all that's to say this is happening right in front of our eyes. Yes, you have a question.
Yes. What's happening with the maple trees? With maple trees,
I'm not an expert in maple.
but are they moving north?
I'm sure they are, yeah. So I'm sure that there are maples showing up at the north end of their range. We're kind of towards the center, so I don't know.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, I would say there's lots of people concerned about the effects of maple. I can't speak to all of those issues.
So how long have you been tracking this migration? How far do you go back on?
I think this is a big meta review, and I wasn't involved in it, but it's I would say is in some cases very early, in other cases it's more recent. So it probably depends on the species and how long it's been observed, between a century, 2 centuries to 10 years, depending on the species. So the long and short of this is we're going to lose some species and we're going to gain some as climate unfolds and climate change continues to unfold in our state. So that's kind of an overview of composition. So like really at the species level. And then the next concept I want to dwell on is this idea of structure. How's biodiversity structured? How are ecosystems structured? And this is, these kind of bleary photos might be some of my best. And I'm actually very excited about these. This is probably the best photo pair I've ever gotten showing the structural difference between kind of a younger intermediate forest and an old growth forest. And so they're both taken from the Adirondacks. The photo on the left is the younger forest and the photo on the right is an archetypal old growth forest stand in the Adirondacks. And what's so neat about them is it's like if you took the photo on the left and then turned the time dial or management dial forward to what old forest looks like, it's a really great pair. So for the benefit of the people in the room, this is a little young red spruce and we have a large red spruce here. We have little tiny downed wood, we have massive downed wood. We have a teeny tiny little tip up and we have a large tip up. So it's kind of, I mean, the photo pair is really great to think about looking at the left and the right. And so one of the consequences of this is that, so although if you look at just at the measure of tree species in the photo, they're nearly identical, but they have wildly different structure, and that structure is tied back to composition. So a forest with this type of structure can support different types of species than this one on the left. Like especially if you look at birds, which have a lot of habitat preferences, some of them need old trees and standing snags for essential parts of their life cycle. They have different foraging needs. So even though those things are out of sight, this structure is really tied to the composition. And then it's also tied to the next bucket, which is function. So what do these landscapes do for us? If you think, what are those functions of the land that we'd like? Providing clean air, storing carbon. There's definitely a difference between the left and the right photo and the amount of carbon that's stored. So that's just one end of like, when we talk about structure, that's what we mean. And then so for context, the photo on the right would have been the dominant landscape condition prior to the arrival of European colonists. And now many of our forests are kind of in this intermediate second growth status. They're not really young, they're not really old, and they lack a lot of these structural characteristics that we find on the photo on the right. And so these two photos that represent the end of the spectrum, but even in the center, like in our more landscapes that are devoted more towards timber production and management, this idea of structural diversity is really important. A lot of foresters are trying to improve the structural diversity of their stands because that makes them more resilient to climate change. So even at I've showed you two ends of the spectrum, but it's an important concept that cuts all the way across.
Excuse me, yes?
Yeah.
You don't mind? Thank you. Very interesting point that you made and certainly understandable about the carbon storage. I can certainly see that there would be more carbon stored in the older growth just because there's more mass there,
Yeah.
right? But could you talk a little bit about the active storing on a per day, per month, per year basis of old versus new? Is the absorption of carbon out of the atmosphere greater or less in which of the two?
So I think that the sequestration rate is,
Sequestration.
yeah,
Thank you.
so this is not my area of deep expertise, but I believe that's considered to be higher in younger forests, but the overall amount that's stored is large in an older forest. So there's that idea of like rate and then the volume,
Exactly.
and those things, you need to consider both of those.
Correct. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So that's one function. Let's see. So I mentioned that, yeah, the photo on the right was at one point the dominant landscape condition. And it's impractical and unrealistic to think we're going to return the entire landscape to that condition. And depending on the source that you look at, kind of good conservation targets would return maybe between 9 to 15%, depending on context or source, to this kind of more forest condition. Okay, so the same idea of structure is also relevant to our freshwater systems. So again, on the left, we have a stream that is devoid of some of the essential structure. And then on the right, we have added some structure. So this comes from a Nature Conservancy restoration project in one of our natural areas. So we've got a pre-restoration and a post-restoration. And so the photo on the left, although that looks like a very pristine mountain stream, it's incised. It does not connect it to its floodplain, and it lacks some of the critical habitat structures that support aquatic biodiversity. So what we did was we added lots of wood to the stream to create some of that structure. So what that wood does is it changes the way the stream flows and the shape of the bed. And from a fish perspective, this action is believed to it improves trout biomass by like 200 to 300% in a matter of years. It's amazing. The Fish and Wildlife Department has been doing a lot of work on this front. So there's that. You add the wood, it changes the stream, and it creates this habitat complexity that really boosts aquatic productivity. But the other thing it does is by reconnecting the stream to its floodplain, it provides a lot of benefits to us. So this act of adding wood to streams and restoring channel complexity, according to some research kind of across a lot of projects, estimates that what this does is it increases the floodplain inundation by both extent and depth by about 30%. So in a mountain stream, if you've done this, what you've done is you're now increasing the storage capacity of your headwaters. So this, like if your headwater forests are a sponge, like this helps that sponge soak up more water and keep it from flowing downhill immediately. And the other thing it does is it reduces channel speed by a measure of like 10%. So this act of restoring structure to streams helps improve the floodwater storage of our streams, particularly important in the headwaters.
Yes, can I ask-
Representative North, I think it's important for us to just,
Let it go.
nope, I encourage questions, but just be called on. Thanks.
By you.
Yes, okay, thank you for the clarification.
Yes, so does the wood entry into the waterways require animal activity like beavers? Is that what we're looking to improve here, or is it just allowing natural fall downs to occur as what?
I think it's a combination of all sorts of things. This is a project where we sent a saw crew out and they dropped trees and then kind of winched them into place to hold them steady. Because we felt it was really important and that the timeline of forest development where the trees would get old enough and big enough to fall in and die on their own was too far out. And we wanted to improve habitat in the short term and also get those, flood storage functions in the immediate. Yeah, of course. And I want to say that, just for context, 75% of our surveyed river miles and stream miles are in this incised condition where they don't have that access to our floodplain. So that flood storage capacity of our stream infrastructure is greatly diminished, which I'm sure is very familiar territory for this group of people. Okay. And so this is I think this example in particular really underscores that biodiversity, and it's particularly this kind of structural lens, is one thing that really clearly ties to our human well-being. And so there are lots of different ways to describe ecosystem functions, which is kind of the last lens I want to add to this biodiversity conversation. And so some of these will limit the definition to just what those functions do for us. So that's like flood storage or carbon storage. And then others will talk about this kind of more wider range of things, including, that are really more tied to like an ecological lens. So you could, I don't know, I feel like you just don't have to look very hard to start thinking about human benefits. So I don't think there's really a reason to distinguish them. And this flooding one is a really great example. So we talked a lot about floodwater storage. So our floodplain forests are an essential kind of safeguard against some of the most severe impacts of flooding with their ability to slow and store floodwaters. But that function is also essential for natural systems, right? So when you flood, it creates this pulse of nutrients into the freshwater system that actually improves fish biomass. So that flux of nutrients in creates healthier and bigger fish. And then if you wanted to look for the human benefit of that, if you're an angler, I think that's obvious. But what I like about this example is it just a functional, diverse ecosystem is beneficial for both the natural world and the human world. It's like the two go hand in hand. Another function I want to talk about is the ability of our natural systems to support and wildlife as they move and respond to climate change. So how can we have diverse, structurally complex natural systems in the future? We need to allow wildlife to move on their own accord in response to climate change. And this graphic was created by the Nature Conservancy, and it's kind of a simulation of how species are moving and going to respond to climate change. And it looks at the 490 different species of mammal, birds, and amphibians and kind of plots their potential migration route. It's very general. As they move upslope and northwards, finding suitable habitats as our climate continues to warm. And one of the things that becomes readily apparent looking at this slide is what a critical role the Appalachians have to kind of as a conduit for species movement, and that Vermont is kind of right in the beeline of that high flow, lots of movement area. So we have an essential role when we think about like zooming back and looking at the continental scale. Vermont has this outsized role in supporting species as they move and adapt to climate change. And this type of conservation planning and looking at, where is the movement going to happen, what places are likely to be resilient to climate change is really what underscores the Nature Conservancy's science and planning and underscores our continental approach to conservation. Could talk about that all day, but I want to move on.
Does anyone have questions about that though? And we have actually had, we've had longer explorations of that, and we may have time for that at some point in the future to not quite all day, but allow you to expound further. Representative Richard Tagliani.
I have a question. The rates 11 miles per decade north and 36 feet per decade upslope. How far back does that study go?
Good question. It was asked earlier, and I don't think I answered it satisfactorily. And it depends on the species, and I don't have all those numbers off the top of my head. But some species we have a very long track record for, and other species for how long.
Could you give me an example? Is it 100 years, 200, 500 years?
I think it would depend on the species, but we have biological information that goes back to their arrival of European colonists and before, for some species. And then for some species that are less poorly understood, it's much more recent, matter of decades or years. So it all depends.
Which actually makes me think of another thread that we've explored a little bit in this committee of paleoecology, and that there's a whole group of scientists right now working on building that record even further back and understanding like what did the landscape look like before European settlement from the perspective of the species that were here before us.
Yeah.
Amazing, really interesting work and there are some folks we can have in doing work in Vermont, which is exciting on that front too.
Yeah.
Representative Austin.
Yes, I just want to go back 1 minute to the flooding and the stream restoration. Yesterday, we heard testimony about flooding and how because of the climate change and the flooding events, it's impacting the lakes in Vermont. And I'm wondering if the stream restoration, does that slow or limit the amount of phosphorus that would enter the lakes? Would that do anything to abate that?
It depends on the context and setting, but yes, I believe that it's an emerging body of science that shows the amount of phosphorus that some of these practices can trap. Yeah, I think folks are still trying to figure out how much and where and what those contexts are to think about deploying that as a water quality approach. But I think that the ties are there and they're being explored.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
of course. So thinking, taking that continental scale view of Vermont and shrinking it down to the northern forest. Think about connectivity again. This map shows the outline of the northern Appalachian forest, which has been a longstanding conservation target for lots and lots of different conservation organizations, particularly thinking about how do we keep this northern forest connected. And one of the reasons that this area has received so much attention is we live in one of the world's greatest remaining forests. It's one of the largest examples of its forest type left on the planet. And we have done a really admirable job of conserving these large cores. But we know that for forests and all the species that live in them to be healthy, there's this concept of scale. We need species to be able to move within these ecoregions. So wide-ranging mammals like moose or lynx need to be able to move between suitable habitats. And then when you think about climate change, right, we need to support the migration of species in, species within this ecoregion, and then species out. And so this map shows some of the highlighted, wildlife corridors or linkages that we believe are critical within our kind of larger northern forest region. And again, you can see that Vermont has this kind of outsized role as a crossroads for connectivity for species within this landscape or within this ecoregion. So kind of as we land the rocket ship, right, from seeing it from outer space, the continental scale, and then down to this region, you can see Vermont has this really important role in connectivity, right? We have kind of a linchpin in this northern forest system. And so, like I said, we've been really successful in protecting these forest cores. And there's a lot of people who are now trying to really take a close look at what does it take to protect the linkages between them. And so for context, if you look at an acre by acre basis, conservation outpaces development in the Northeast. We have a conservation machine that keeps up with landscape loss on an acre by acre basis, but it's where those acres are being lost that's really an important thought. So Vermont loses 10 to 12,000 acres of forest per year, according to, I believe it's the U.S. Forest Service. And that number is not necessarily, fairly neutral on the number, but it's kind of, it depends on where it is, right? So if you are losing acreage in a wildlife corridor, it has much more impact than if you're losing it without. And so there's just a kind of a multi-pronged approach to think about connectivity that includes policy, includes municipal zoning, includes a lot of direct action by organizations like conservation partners, like the Nature Conservancy, the state, and other folks in this larger Staying Connected initiative. And it also has this really interesting tie with roads and the Agency of Transportation. And I want to just kind of impart this thought that we need to think about connecting our conserved lands and our big remaining forests. And that when you start pulling that thread, it starts to involve a lot of people. And I want to just pause and also recognize that the Vermont Agency of Transportation and Fish and Wildlife Department are considered leaders in our region in thinking about this and thinking about how our road infrastructure can support wildlife while at the same time improving its function, reducing vulnerabilities to communities. So if you think about right-sizing culverts to allow wildlife to provide safe passage under the road, there are also a lot of flood benefits from that for people, right? So if we have undersized infrastructure, that's bad for everybody.
And then Sakowitz.
Yeah, Gus, what does the dark green actually represent?
Oh, those are that's what's considered interior, like large cores of interior forest. So it's not a map of remaining forest. It's not a map of conserved lands. It's a map of where are kind of the largest, most intact forests. Using a couple of different thresholds.
And actually, if you wouldn't mind, because it's not zoomed in very well, it kind of goes from Vermont north. If you just could orient us a little bit to the southwest corner of where your map starts.
Oh, okay. So this is the Berkshires down, and then these arrows try to draw into the larger Appalachian network. So remember that first map had these arrows moving all the way up to Appalachians, and this is kind of where they land, and then moving up into Vermont, over to the Adirondacks, up into the northern New Hampshire and Maine, and up into the Maritimes and Acadian region of Canada.
Mm-hmm. And within Vermont, it does look like it's mostly the conserved lands already, not necessarily all of our forests.
Well, like I said, we've done a good job conserving these large forest cores. So a lot of there's a parallel between a map of the forest cores and our conserved lands.
Well, a lot of Vermont is more forest than what I'm seeing, at least maybe from the
Yes.
back of the room, than what's
Yeah.
on this map.
Yes.
What I'm saying, a lot of the forest isn't conserved, or I'm not sure if it is, it looks like conserved land to me. I don't know. It doesn't look like forest cover.
It's not
In
forest.
Vermont. Okay.
Right, it's the more interior forests of a certain size.
It's core forest areas only. Thank you. I'm
Sorry if that wasn't.
catching up. Representative Tagliavia.
You made mention of a number of acres that is forest that's lost. It's in
I believe
excess of 10,000 acres.
Per year, yes.
Is that lost to development, or does that include clear cuts that are left to then go back to regrow?
A clear cut that returns to forest is not forest loss. So I believe this is land use conversion from a natural habitat to an anthropogenic one. So it could be development, it could be any number of things.
Would that include loss to agriculture as well?
Okay. All right, so try to pause and put a few pieces back together here. So we've talked about biodiversity, what that means, the different ways you can describe it, its composition, its structure, its function. We've talked a little bit about the scale as an important dimension too, like if you're talking about biodiversity of a place versus a country, you have a different lens. We've talked about ecological integrity, which is a way to begin to think about describing the status of biodiversity or its condition. And I want to introduce one last concept, which is the ecologically functional landscape, which I think is a really nice complement to those because it provides a goal, right? So if we can describe it, we can begin to measure it, and now we want to know like what is the pace we want to aim for, and that is the ecologically functional landscape. And we're fortunate in Vermont to have Vermont Conservation Design, which is a planning tool that's been developed by the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife with support from other state agencies and conservation partners, including the Nature Conservancy. And it is oriented around this concept of an ecologically functional landscape that's intact, it's connected, and it's diverse. And that's another way of saying, it has the composition we want, the structure we want, and those functions we want. So this is a very comprehensive conservation plan. It has a large footprint. And if this is the first time you're seeing Vermont Conservation Design, I want to stress that this is not a protection map. This is it outlines a footprint where we want to be bringing every dimension of conservation to. So private landowners, policy, incentives, direct action by conservation organizations. So this is not a protected all map. This is a place where we want to be thinking about bringing the full suite of tools available to us to think about sustaining all that we care about and all the biodiversity that this footprint contains. And there is again, a whole nother presentation to be had here that would be, I think, probably a nice follow-up for this committee at some point if it's helpful.
Which we will certainly have.
Yeah, thank you. And what's nice about this is that this plan is very comprehensive, and it works all the way from that regional scale that we looked at down to a very fine scale. Oh, that wasn't the plan. And it has these various mentions of interior forest, connecting forest, geological diversity, surface water and riparian areas, and then these fine scale elements of natural communities and species. So it really does take a broad slice of this kind of what is the composition of our state, what types of structural dimensions that are important to retain, and then what are that large landscape footprint that's necessary for the ecologically functional landscape. And so the last kind of three thoughts I want to end with is that as decision makers, I think that the definition of biodiversity is important, and to understand its complexity and nuance, right? Because as we've talked about here in this committee, it really depends on what scale you're thinking about, or what dimension. Is it just the number of species? Is it the structure? Are we only concerned about the functions and the end result of these natural systems? And I hope that it's been clear that you can't really have one without the other. You need all of the species present in the variety of structural forms they take to have some of those functions. The three are intrinsically tied together. And so as you consider interventions, being precise about which the facets of biodiversity are the targets, or which threats are you trying to abate, I think is an important concept. Second, I want to just underscore that Vermont Conservation Design is probably the best guide for conservation of biodiversity in Vermont, and helps answer some of those questions about, well, what is good biodiversity or bad biodiversity? It doesn't use that language, but it's one of the things that can start to help decision makers address, or what are the desired outcomes. And lastly, just underscoring that this idea of an ecologically functional landscape is kind of the goal, and it's essential to have a fully functional landscape to support biodiversity, but it's also so clearly tied to our own well-being. These intact, connected, diverse forests are the ones that are best at storing carbon, storing floodwaters, providing habitat for the game species that we cherish, and the kind of vital backdrop for recreation, tourism, and just community connection that I think we all draw upon from the natural world. So I will stop there and answer any questions if there's time remaining. I've lost track of time. Hope we're doing okay.
Yeah, we definitely have some time for questions if folks have some. Representative Bartholomew.
Earlier, if I understood you correctly, early on you were talking about invasive species and that that the carbon sequestration isn't as robust. Did I get that right?
It's that forest pests and pathogens, they kill trees, they stress them.
I see.
And when trees die and are stressed, can sequester and store less carbon.
Okay, all right. Like I said, I was thinking that knotweed is obviously gonna block out other native
Yeah.
species, but it will sequester carbon.
Oh, that's an interesting question. And I think that like a more annual plant versus the plant that stores carbon in wood, that the trade-offs are not really comparable.
My other question, remember what it was? It went away. Oh, you had the pictures of the two forests, the younger forest, the old growth. How long does it take to get from one to the other?
It
Like, and I'm
totally,
thinking here in
yeah.
terms of early 1900s when Vermont was basically deforested and now we're 125 years later. How far are we along on that path?
Well, it depends, I guess, on the starting point of an individual stand. And there's a really tremendous resource published by Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro that answers that very question. And it talks about, depending where you are, if you take a passive strategy, how long it takes to accrue some of those key benchmarks of an old forest, versus if you have a more active management approach. So, it provides some really interesting data on that front. But if you're looking for a number, I would say like, I don't know, probably 100 years, but it really depends on the stand. So it's kind of, I don't know how to speak in generality about it.
But 100 years might be enough.
Sure.
And you don't need 1,000.
No, it depends on what your finish line is,
Yeah.
but, yes, I think to accrue some of the structural characteristics that are consistent with old forest, we're not looking at thousands of years. It's much more immediate time frame.
Representative Sakowicz.
Gus, I'm wondering if you can send us a link to that study that you just referenced.
Yeah, absolutely.
Love to see
We're
that.
trying to keep a note of things to follow up on. We'll add that as one.
Representative Chapin.
And we don't have your presentation.
Not yet.
Right. My question is sort of big picture. Wonderful background presentation. Thank you for getting us up to speed on all of that. Really, what are the biggest barriers to the kind of work we need to do from here to support particularly that potential movement of species through this corridor?
I think it depends on your tool, right? So the barriers for like my organization will be very different than the barriers for if you were like, so that's like we do a lot of direct habitat protection, but if you're thinking about a legislative approach, that's a different answer. So I'll say that
I'm thinking at the community scale.
I get across the state.
Yes, yeah, all of us collectively, what are the biggest barriers?
Great question. So from a protection, it's really about the ability to purchase land and steward for the future, and manage that land responsibly as the climate changes. I think balancing all of the various needs and having a way to put them side by side. I do believe that this vision is completely consistent with a lot of the other visions for the state that's affordable to live in, that produces food, that produces energy. It's really a conversation of putting those trade-offs together and understanding where we want to do things and others, and just achieving that balance. I think one of the challenges is when you make a lot of ad hoc decisions, you start to just move in a direction, and then it's different than if you have a more proactive approach to delineate growth and conservation.
Yep, just, I tell you the two questions that were asked were questions I was gonna ask, but when you say in terms of human well-being, well-being is kind of soft to
Oh,
me.
sure. Intentionally so.
Oh, it is intentional.
Well, no, I mean,
Okay.
it's such a wide lens, right?
Yeah,
Depends
but-
on what aspect. So please ask your question.
Well, could you just elaborate a bit? Well-being, is that survival or is it just that we're comfortable?
Well, I think that if you, depends on your answer, right? So if, in an era where we expect more frequent floods, I think that our natural world provides one way of protecting us from those. If we can protect and restore the flood storage capacity of our forests, that's, I guess there's a survival aspect there. There's a financial survival for a lot of people who are heavily impacted by that. And then I don't know, the emotional stress of flooding. So it kind of depends on your answer. I think there's a lot of, I know there are a lot of industries that are dependent on a like thriving natural world. I think that, I don't have the data off the top of my head, but just fall foliage is essential contribution to our tourism economy. And if that's declining, I think there's fear that that will have consequences for people's livelihood.
Hence my questions about maple trees.
Yeah, exactly. So lots of industries are dependent upon our natural world. Their fate hangs in.
Representative Clark, yeah.
You mentioned something. Representative North asked a question about sequestration versus storage.
Mhm.
At what age in the forest do those intersect? Do you know?
Oh, I don't know, but I could recommend someone to speak to, or
We've had
Just
great,
curious.
great insights from people doing that. It's kind of cutting edge research at this point, but we have had some really great lectures basically from research scientists. We can have them in, and Gus, I'd welcome your suggestions.
thank you.
Representative Nora.
Sorry to keep asking questions, and this one might not be in your wheelhouse, but I've heard of one of your opening statements indicated that that Nature Conservancy owns and manages significant chunks
That's right.
of land. Along with, what are the constraints or restrictions on that ownership? A concept coming around called natural asset classes or natural asset companies that look to essentially monetize natural aspects of conserved or natural lands, forest lands. And I'm wondering, are there any restrictions on the Nature Conservancy's use of the lands that are owned there to take advantage of or even sell those rights for the called NACs, the natural asset class or national asset companies of those lands?
I have never heard of that.
Okay.
So be doing some Googling after this to learn more. But I will say that on a parcel by parcel basis, our land is subject to a wide variety of deeds and easement restrictions. We do a lot of, it's called belt and suspenders conservation. So for example, anything that we've protected with funding from Vermont Housing and Conservation Board comes with an additional easement held by the state that would, places lots of limits on the land use. And then we have internal policies that would, for if there are some lands we own fee simple with no other additional restrictions that I think if we were to ever transfer anything, it needs to have a conservation gain. So
Yeah, I would encourage you to look into that concept, natural asset classes.
thank you. But yeah,
It's a bit scary, actually, frankly, going forward as to who actually owns all those natural asset rights. Can they be sold and transferred and maybe even transferred out of the country and owned by country holders, stakeholders? I could foresee some legislation in Vermont protecting those rights and keeping them within Vermont as well as one of the things I'm concerned about.
Interesting, yeah. So I have a couple questions. I am curious, in my neck of the woods, there's been an increase in the amount of natural disturbance that's happening. We're in the throes of a kind of a conversation around the expediting of some of the ecosystem functions that you've shared with us today. And I guess I'm wondering, what the Nature Conservancy's current, I'm sure you're thinking about this because you kind of can't walk through the woods and miss it. You know, the microbursts of wind disturbing, creating natural openings and expediting without our interference or our engagement, this movement back towards a more diverse, you know, microclimates, landscapes. Do you have thoughts on that? Or are you all working on that?
I think it's one of those, like, it depends questions, and I know it's an unsatisfying answer. But if your, primary orientation was around the needs of a single species, you would have to ask, like, is that type of disturbance help that species thrive, or does it impede its survival? And if it was in a situation where that type of disturbance was bad for a species, you might manage your land to make it less vulnerable to those types of disturbances. There's plenty of instances in which that disturbance is essential for long-term species survival. So you're gaining, like as you were describing, some of that natural process that's helpful for species. And then if you have a more monetary objective from your forests, I think.
Because I'm thinking about the old growth benefits of protecting, getting natural function and the things you're talking about in our headwater streams. And I'm not, I get that would be different, but I'm thinking broadly towards the goals of having, the 10% of old forest characteristics out in our landscape. Is anyone monitoring like that or working on understanding, do we really need to expedite, or things are accelerating now, and maybe that's plenty.
I see. Yes. I think it probably depends on your vantage point and whatever piece of land you're managing. I don't have a satisfying answer because I think it's a really complicated one, and it's one I've wondered a lot about.
Yeah.
Like, how much do we just roll with the direction that's being headed, or what are the places where we want to be taking more active management to help steer? And I will say that, one of the principles of the Nature Conservancy's approach to climate change is we consider there's kind of three approaches to take with land, which is, you kind of accept the impacts that are coming and monitor to make sure they're not undesirable impacts. You can try to resist them to try and protect exactly what you have and make it least vulnerable to change as possible. And then the third is just managing those transitions. So, and that's kind of what we consider to be the resilience option, is accepting that our natural systems have disturbance, and it's about managing those transitions. And so I guess it depends on, again, your land, what types of disturbances you're having, and how much capacity you have to manage these transitions as they come up versus your ability to think like, well, we can only do these projects proactively, so we need to kind of get ahead of the disturbances.
And so you have a purposeful conversation about each property you have in those three categories, and decide, and you create a management plan based on that.
That's how we've approached it.
That's what I wanted to.
Yeah, sorry.
How does the Nature Conservancy address that issue?
Yeah, so we looked across our land portfolio and said, these are places where we anticipate this type of change. We don't, and we had what is the anticipated change? How confident are we in that? How confident are we in our ability that there's anything we can do about it? Do we know enough? So we had this kind of structured decision-making conversation, and we identified a short list of properties that we felt like were vulnerable to climate change impacts, that there were things that we could identify that we could do to help prepare and address those, and also at a scale that's going to make use of our limited stewardship capacity, right? Because that's a real dimension for everybody as land managers, is how much can you actually do? So we went through that effort, and we identified a handful that we're really proactively engaged on.
Thank you. And I guess I'm curious, do you, to Representative Austin's question about impacting the capacity of headwater streams, do you all consider, when you're looking at the management of your properties, like impacts to the TMDL, the Lake Champlain TMDL?
I think this goes to your question about the phosphorus benefit of certain practices. And I think that, as I understand it, that's a nascent conversation. How much of our wood addition and the beaver-based restoration we try to do, what is the phosphorus impact? So I would say it's not a direct consideration of our management, it's an indirect one.
Maybe will indulge me further. I have one more. I really interested in, I went to gathering, maybe you were there, a lot of interest in knotweed. There's been a lot of interest in knotweed in the environmental community for, it's fair to say, decades in Vermont. And I guess at this point, I would like to know, has anyone actually reforested a riparian corridor that successfully blocked out knotweed? I feel like there's this idea that we can keep kind of having unvegetated riparian areas and we wage this war with knotweed, but in my experience, knotweed goes away when you shade it out. So has there been a restoration project that successfully shaded it out that you know of?
No, not that but I don't consider myself an authority on knotweed. The last time I worked on that was more than a decade ago in a very different context, so.
Yeah. I guess I'm just
Yeah.
wanting to know if anyone's tried a larger restoration project that has moved. Representative Pritchard.
So I'm going way back to the bird chart.
Okay.
Okay. So have you identified what the reason is that the wetland birds have gone to the other side of the chart? What things have contributed to that you've identified?
Well, I think it's all speculation. I mean, there's like a correlation causation thing, right? So it's hard to say this is the thing that did it, right? Especially across a huge group of species.
But it's the only one.
Right. But so I think, if you were to think about it, is there analogous protection for other habitats as we have for wetlands? Like wetlands have a de facto policy or legislative protection. There are wetland mitigation programs. There are conservation organizations exclusively focused on wetland restoration. There are migratory bird protections. It's really this kind of full suite of kind of really leaning into protection for those habitats and those species that I think has turned the tide. So I don't know if it's a single one. I mean, you could even make a point that all the clean air legislation that happened in the 70s is an essential piece of that too, because atmospheric deposition of mercury and nitrogen is a real concern for wetland birds. And so if we've reduced emissions of those particular pollutants, that's another piece that's contributing to their long-term survival. So it's really kind of a multi-dimensional approach that is very comprehensive.
Do you think the change with the climate has played an effect on that?
Oh, like is climate making things wetter so there's more wetlands and better wetland birds? That's an interesting question. I would doubt that because climate impacts the country in various different ways. Like we happen to be getting wetter, other places happen to be getting drier. So the status of wetlands in New England is very different than the status of wetlands in the area.
But is your chart specific to the
It's North
species?
America.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but I dive deep into the full report and find some more information.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. And good press on the species composition angle of biodiversity. It's important.
Representative Bartholomew.
I was going to point out that trying to figure out what's happening with birds is so complex because they have this tendency to migrate. So you can't just look at what we're doing here,
Right.
because the other end of the migration route is as important and in many cases more important than
Right.
what we do.
Yeah, and the Vermont Center for Eco Studies has done great work highlighting just that.
So it's really difficult to say us doing this here had a positive impact because they're not just endemic right here, they travel.
Right. So that is also true, but it also is true that there are very specific things you can do to improve
Oh, yeah.
certain parts of their life cycle or times of their life that are
And many
very critical.
breed
Yeah.
That's a good one. Thank you so much for the time to share this with
Thank you
us.
so
I have
much.
a list of follow-ups and I'll do my best to get those to you in a timely manner.
Great.
Thank you.
Right, committee, we have about 10 minutes for a break. Our next agenda item is at 10:15. And I have a couple of public service announcements that I would like to make. I guess I'll just make them right now, which is yesterday afternoon, Vice Chair Glaber and I went to a training for chairs and vice chairs, but it included a really great overview from our clerk, Betsy Ann, on the rules. And I will keep the hard copies here. And this sort of the rules that are particularly pertinent to committee time. And you brought up the great question of, how do we do this and maybe why do we do this? The sort of maintaining civil discourse. And so the rules generally that we utilize on the floor are the same rules that we use in the House. That's the broad way of understanding it. So when you start to understand the rules of the floor and why we abide by them, it'll be easier for you to understand perhaps the transition to why we do it in here, but we're kind of a microcosm of that world. And we're in education mode and things are pretty calm right now, but we'll have our moments in here. And so just maintaining civility helps us function and be able to hear each other better and be respectful. And I find that practicing that really sets a stage for when things can get a little bit more stressful. And so that's broadly it. I'm happy to have you all borrow this or look at it. And we also have electronic versions of it, but I did find it helpful to have it, Betsy Ann pulled out the relevant pieces and parts. Additionally, I've asked Sarita to be our clerk, and there will be a clerk training. And then in this handout, there's also, and it's highlighted because it's very important to Betsy Ann and the clerk's office, just what we do when we pass a bill out of committee, how it happens, how it can happen differently based on the type of bill we're passing out of committee. It's a little bit nuanced. Probably not worth adding to your fire hose of new information right now, but as we get to that information is here. So anyway, with that, let's take our break. We can